Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk to you today about urban and peri-urban agriculture. So this basically means growing in the cities and around the cities. I'd like to start off with a quote from Audrey Hepburn. To plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. And I think for me this really encapsulates what's most important about urban farming. Is that it's an opportunity for individuals to take control of their food systems and to make it a better food system for the future, and a more sustainable one. Why farm in the cities? It's a very important question. Essentially, the world has now reached a point where there are actually more people living in cities than there are living in the countryside. And so it actually makes a heck of a lot of sense to start growing food in the cities, in the centres of population, close to exactly where the people are. Now, a lot of you might say, well, this is nothing new. And of course you're right. Allotment gardens have been around for hundreds of years. And they've traditionally offered a very good source of dietary supplements to people when they're poor or in times of food shortages. But what we're talking about now is sort of a revitalisation of those traditional and underutilised values. So we're talking about planting, again in people's gardens, planting on the sides of roads, planting on rooftops of buildings, planting in abandoned warehouses and even used warehouses, and also using special technologies to convert and rejuvenate degenerated and toxic soils. Now, what's really amazing about urban agriculture is actually today in the world it employs around 200 million people. And also provides provides around 800 million people with some or part of their diets. Now what's really particularly interesting about urban agriculture is its relationship with women. Now women are traditionally excluded from the urban labour market, but urban agriculture offers women employment, and it often offers them, it also offers them access to foods, and specifically perishable foods, which are traditionally the most expensive types of food. Now these perishable foods are also incredibly high in vitamins and minerals, and so by allowing people higher access to it, you can actually help combat malnutrition and other horrible deficiencies. Now, one of the key benefits to growing food where people are is that you actually shorten the supply chain. So what it allows you to do is you don't need such intense mechanisation within your agricultural production systems, because you don't need to grow massive monocultures of crops and mechanise it really heavily in order to produce food cheaply enough to actually warrant transporting it the huge distances that food often gets transported. So what this means is you can have a higher input of manual labour, and if manual labour, by that I mean people, and so that in turn means that you're increasing the number of jobs within urban environments. Now, if people do need some sort of machinery equipment, it's very small, such as here you can see a hand rotavator. This is a small, inexpensive piece of equipment which isn't tying up a lot of capital, which is useful for small-scale producers. Also, because like I mentioned before, we're not transporting food large distances, you reduce your need to fly food around the world, ship it halfway around the world, or even transport it in lorries long distances on our roads. So in essence, less food miles means less fossil fuels. Now there is an argument to say that if we say growing tomatoes in a greenhouse in the northern hemisphere, in a heated greenhouse, that there's a comparable amount of fossil fuels burnt when you compare to taking that same tomato from the tropics and flying it through to the northern hemisphere. Now while that may be true, I think that raises sort of a deeper question that we should be asking ourselves is why are we eating all this fruit and vegetable out of season? So in general, I'd like to say that some studies have looked into this, and they have found that local food on average travels around 56 miles, whereas food grown in industrialised food systems can travel up to 1,500 miles on average. So this means that you actually non-local food systems can use anywhere between 4 to 17 times more fossil fuels, which is quite amazing, really. Now, the next thing that I'd like to talk to you about is this, food waste. Now, I hope most of you would agree that this is a ridiculous state of affairs, because food waste basically implies food which could be eaten, perfectly able to be eaten, but doesn't get eaten. Now, one of the wastes from food is that actually a lot of it does perish during long transport and distribution chains, which I've talked about a little bit about. So what we can do within urban agriculture is we can actually pick the food at the correct ripeness and then even sell it at the site of production. So obviously your food can be into the home when it's ripe and hopefully can be eaten sort of straight away. Also, if you're not involving large retailers, you're not subject to sell-by dates and strict quality standards. Now, these strict quality standards basically mean that food which, say, isn't quite the right shape or the right colour, even though it's perfectly edible, ends up getting thrown away. And we can, with urban agriculture, we can help mitigate some of these problems. And also involving people in food production. When they see it being grown around them, it gives them a greater appreciation, and this in turn has been shown to help reduce food waste in the home. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would like to be able to do this, and this is turning waste into resources. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of countries, it is legislated against people being able to feed household waste, or what's known as pig swill, to pigs. But what we can do is we can take our food waste, we can compost it, and we can use that compost to grow more food. Now, we can actually take this a step further, and interestingly, there's been some research in China recently, which has been looking into human waste, and how we can recycle human waste instead of sending it out to sea, which has traditionally been the case. Now, human waste is actually incredibly high in organic matter, and it potentially offers an almost unlimited supply of nutrients and fertilizers, which could easily be used in urban agriculture, as that's where most human waste occurs. Now, I'd like to also talk to you about this idea of reusing waste resources. One particularly prominent example is aquaponics. Now, aquaponics is the marriage of aquaculture, growing fish, with the practice of hydroponics, which is the practice of growing food without soil. So what you can essentially do is you can take the wastes from your fish, you can send it round into your artificial food growing beds. There, the nitrogen and so forth can be converted by the bacteria and the worms into a form that the plants can take up, and then those plants will take up those nutrients, and that will clean the water, and that can be sent back round to the fish. Now, to start off with, it's worth noting that fish are actually the most efficient form of farming livestock. And on average, a species of fish such as tilapia will have a feed conversion of around 1.5 to 1. So what that actually means is that for every 1.5 kilos of fish feed, you get a kilo of fish, which is a feed conversion ratio that animals on land could never even hope for. And because the system is so efficient in recycling its nutrients in this efficient way, for every kilogram of fish that you grow, you can grow between 30 and 50 kilograms of fruit and vegetables. So obviously this system has inputs and outputs. Number one input being fish feed. Now, unfortunately, fish feed often means actual fish, which has literally been harvested from the sea. Now, clearly feeding fish to fish is not efficient use of resources. Another input is water. It takes around 5% of the whole system needs to be topped up every single day. But in terms of comparing it to many other farming systems, that's an incredible figure to arrive at. And also it takes energy to power the pumps and to keep the fish warm. Now, from these inputs, we obviously get fish and we get vegetables. Now, what we can do, if we want to try and close this loop down even further, what we can do is we can take the remains of fish, so the guts and the heads, and we can actually culture them with black blowfly larvae. Now, unfortunately, in lots of countries, legislation doesn't allow you to then feed that back to the same animal. So what you could do is you could take those black soldier fly larvae and feed them to chickens. And with chickens, obviously, you get eggs as well. So you're having another output from your system. Now, what you can also do is you can take the remains from your from your chicken production and culture that again with black blowfly larvae, and those could in turn be fed to your fish. Now, what we could also do is take the remains from your vegetable production and put that into vermiculture or wormeries. And of course then you have worms, which you could also feed to your fish. So in this way you could close the loop down and actually start reducing your inputs of food. Another thing that you could do is you could combine this with a rainwater harvesting system, which again would help reduce inputs of water. And this technology is particularly combinable with solar, photovoltaics, but also you could equally combine it with short rotation coppice willow in order to get your energy inputs. So that would provide you with some electricity and heating needs. Now, if you think all of this is essentially very nice in theory, but you couldn't really see it working in practice, I'd ask you to think again. Cuba is the prime example where this sort of thing has really happened and really worked. Basically, at the end of the Cold War, Cuba was effectively completely cut off from the rest of the world in terms of trade. And so the country quite literally had to become self-sufficient overnight. Now, what's amazing is that not only was it self-sufficient, but it was organic food they produced self-sufficiently because they had no access to oil. And it's basically sparked a revolution, what became known as the organoponics revolution. And what essentially happened is that the government and community gardening programs took over every available space in cities and just grew food. And the country basically became self-sufficient, almost, like I said, overnight. With up until only fairly recently, only 16% of the country's food needed to be imported, which is really quite amazing. I'd like to say at this point that urban agriculture can never really compete with conventional agriculture in terms of staple foods. Clearly, on the Great Prairies of America, you can produce grain and cereals very cheaply. However, what you can't do is produce perishable foods so cheaply. So I would like to say that urban agriculture genuinely has a potential role to produce a substantial amount of, and a really meaningful amount of food for urban environments. And at the same time, it can help nourish people as well as diets. Thank you very much. Any questions?